the link will also appear in the chat box, and then you will be able to reach it later on. I will also want to introduce our second speaker for the second seminar that will happen on June 4th, titled Consensual Unions, Property Rights and Patrimonial Violence Against Women in Latin America. It will be led by Professor Carmen Diana Deere, Distinguished Professor Emerita of Latin American Studies and Food and Resource Economics in 2 countries. And we are very welcome for you to join in for it as well. The registration is very similar. The link will appear on the chat box. Please register and join. The time will be a little bit different. It will start at 4 p.m. because we want to accommodate also people joining in from Latin America. The last point, we will try our best to transcribe this seminar to make it accessible for people with different access issues. If you think that any other accommodation would be very welcome, please let us know and we will try our best to accommodate this as well. Now I want to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Leder. Stephanie represents Swedish University of Agricultural Science and United Nations University. She is the researcher at the development of urban and rural development with interest in feminist political ecology, local water governance, agrarian change, gender and development research, and transformative pedagogy. She holds a project grant to conduct research on farmer-managed irrigation systems in the context of out-migration in Nepal, funded by Formus Swedish Research Council. And now I leave it to you, Stephanie, to present, and I will stop sharing my screen. Thank you very much for coming to us, Stephanie. Your topic sounds really interesting, and I can't wait to hear more about it.
Thank you very much, Marina, and everyone attending. I'll try to share my screen now, so you can follow my presentation. Does that work well?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm very happy to be the first speaker of this Gender Research in Action in the Global South seminar series. It's very exciting as this topic is very close to my heart. And I'll speak from my perspective on transformative practice and gender relations in water security projects. I will first start by, in a feminist spirit, reflect my own situated positionality, which already was partly introduced by Marina. So the work I'll be presenting mostly it was initiated while I was a gender postdoc at the International Water Management Institute in Nepal, which is an international agricultural research for development organization of the CGIAR. And now I'm more an academic researcher, you can say, as a Nordic University of Agricultural Sciences with some affiliations at different international institutions in the UK and at the United Nations University in Bonn currently. And despite these institutional affiliation, which probably take up desk time for me, 80% of my time, I inserted some pictures of fieldwork, which is very close to my heart and where all my learnings and my insights come from. You see some pictures from Nepal shortly after the earthquake in 2015, where we were visiting an irrigation system which was affected by the earthquake and leading discussions with the water user associations on what best to do to revitalize the irrigation system. And also on the lower left, you see a picture we conducted after participatory gender training, which my colleague Deepika Das and I developed along with some other colleagues. So these were some moments which were, or reflect much of what I will be talking about. I will first start off with introducing 3 different approaches. The first one is transformative practice, as I learned and understand about it. The second one is what I call reproductive development framings. And the last one is from feminist political ecology. And then I'll move on into 2 case studies to demonstrate how these different approaches are reflected or not in the work. The first one is a BRACED project on women's empowerment and water security programs in Western Nepal. And the second one is a case study on farmer collectives and gendered irrigation technology adoption in North India and Nepal. And lastly, I introduced the approach I developed as kind of the learning, which evolved as a learning process out of these 2 case studies of more transdisciplinary research for development projects. And this approach was basically grounded in critical pedagogy and FPE. And it's participatory gender training for community groups. So I would like to focus a bit on the tensions between these 3 approaches, which I call reproductive development, transformative practice, and feminist political ecology, as probably many of you know. And one project I'll take as a sample will be located between the tension between reproductive development and FPE, feminist political ecology, and the other one is a very transdisciplinary, and therefore I put it in the center of these 3 tensions and approaches. So what do I mean by the first one, transformative practice? You might be a bit surprised to see this background. So basically where I first developed this perspective of what is transformative practice was in the context of school education. So I did my PhD in India on education, looking at the implementation of the UN objective of education for sustainable development. And I took the example of water conflicts and looked at how they were treated in Indian geography education classes. So what I basically found is that pedagogic practice, or schooling in general, is always in the tension between social reproduction and transformation of existing relations. So when I first joined a class, I observed in Pune, it was very teacher-centered, focused on facts and memorization. So it was a very closed mode. So existing social hierarchies between the teacher and the students were reproduced. And then my research question or focus of my work was how to move it to more student-oriented approaches, more argumentation, value-based and network thinking learning approaches. And this I called an open mode. So how do we transform social relations? So yeah, transformative practice in opposition to reproductive practices. So what I found now with colleagues in the development sector, when we followed or were engaged in a water project, that yeah, we can talk about reproductive development framings as usual. And many of you working in the sector are probably familiar with buzzwords like women's empowerment, water security, feminization of agriculture, which are mostly approached through technological solutions like providing irrigation pumps or toilets or many other interventions. And the assumption is often linear cause and effects. They are measurable and quantifiable objectives. And the engagement is very managerial. Log frames is a big keyword, or theories of change. And overall, they are often still very apolitical approaches. So we can call this a closed mode. When we go now into the literature of feminist political ecology as a more academic approach, I suppose, it aims at analyzing the reproduction of unequal power relations in natural resource management. So it takes a relational approach, taking intra-household and intra-community relations into account, which actually shape access and control over water. So the idea is to work with intersectionality, to not essentialize women and men as homogeneous groups, but according to other intersecting aspects like class, age, ethnicity, or caste in the South Asian context. And gendered subjectivities are produced and shift over space and time and in everyday context. So this approach is representing an open mode. So just to give you an overview of the three approaches, the terminology, and please, like, it's very seen as a generalizing frame to help make a differentiation. So, I mean, it's still debatable, but as an overview, it's the reproductive development works in the terminology with buzzwords, FPE conceptually, and transformative practice more practically. And the impact or assumptions of relations in reproductive development is linear cause and effects, while feminist political ecology assumes messy relations, and transformative practice thinks of oscillating processes. The power concept is often apolitical in reproductive development. In FPE, it's everywhere, and transformative practice tries to or re-hierarchize existing power relations. And solutions are often technological and managerial in the reproductive development sphere with quantifiable outputs, and the targets are often development stakeholders and donors, while FPE works with critical reflection, is quite settled in academia and activism, and is more of a critique, and transformative practice is more like engaging in collective action, contextual contexts and communities. So to have these three approaches in mind, I'd like to start introducing the first case study. It was funded by BRACED, Building Resilience and Adaptation to Climate Extremes and Disaster Program by the UK aid. And the project in Nepal was called Anukulan, which means resilience. And the idea was to develop climate resilient livelihoods for local communities through public-private partnerships of 500,000 poor people in Western Nepal that suffer from climate extremes and disasters. And this was a collaboration between a range of local NGOs as well as international organizations as well as research partners. And when we look now into the assumption of the project towards women's empowerment, we find that the development objective was that women become rural entrepreneurs and grassroots leaders. So there was a linear development impact pathway. The idea was to implement pumps, to improve access to and control over water resources, and also by providing training, inputs, and markets. And this would also lead to transforming women in rural entrepreneurs and grassroots leaders. So now when we look from an FPE framing, the assumptions and the framing of gender in water security programs actually risks reproducing and even exacerbating existing gender inequalities in access to and control over water. And I'll explain you how we came to this understanding. So we conducted fieldwork in 2 districts in the very far west of Nepal, Doti and Dadaldura, in particular in 2 villages where the interventions were supposed to be implemented. We worked with different qualitative research methods like interviews and life histories, focus group discussions, empowerment ranking exercises, and village resource mappings. And yeah, we walked about an hour to the village. This is how it looked on the way. And when we went there, we were first, before we were further engaged in understanding how interventions would take place, asking different women what empowerment means to them. So what we heard was quite surprising to us, because we thought they might say money, they might say we need water taps, we might need better schooling. But actually what they said was, someone who gives her opinion and suggestions can be considered empowered. Nirmala is an example. She's educated and working. She's able to discuss and decide. Or empowered women have a good and supportive family. Or empowered is someone with land who does farming and tells us what she has learned. Or having an opinion is being empowered. And of course, in further discussions, this was a method where we wrote down what people said, or even they wrote down or drew what they were considering, and then they were weighting it with stones. some other issues came up, like land ownership, papers, land near home, hard work, farming tools, piped water and land, and courage and knowledge and skills. But what we broadly found really interesting was this relational aspect of empowerment, and not this very individualized one, which was also in a parallel study taken up in a Women's Empowerment in Agricultural Index, where basically a very individualized understanding of empowerment was in place. So we found this quite interesting. And then was the project objective basically to implement water taps and reservation tanks to store water. And here you see some water sources, which were already there at place, like a Nola in the upper right, like a traditional a structure around a water source. The river was taken, was an important source of, for example, for washing water. And then there were already existing taps. So the idea was to implement more taps. There were 8 taps to be implemented, and we followed the process. And we were asking ourselves who benefits and who does not from such water security programs, who is heard and responded to and who is not. And very quickly, the role of knowledge and voice became very important, as some statements say from the farmers we interviewed, on how it was decided that the taps were implemented. One said, those who have a voice will get into new project contracts and receive an own tap. Or I checked the list and my name was not there, so I called the office and told them I need a tap. If my garden is used as a demo garden, then I also need a second tap. So that was actually after we were advising that there were caste issues, that the caste should be recognized. And yeah, when we later came back, we saw that someone even received a second tap. So what was basically happening is that project interventions were highly selective. So they were reproducing existing power relations and provided access to water and agricultural inputs to those who will be most likely the successful model farmers. And at the end, we found that only 1 out of 8 taps was given to the Dalits, which is the lowest caste, despite our recommendations. And there were various reasons given for this. They didn't need it, they already shared some, and so on. And yeah, in the other village, we found a similar thing. You can see here the canal irrigation system and the newly installed RVTs, the reservation tanks. And in the red circle is where the Dalits were actually located. It was kind of like a ditch. So the RVTs were constructed there where the more well-off farmers were living. So who's becoming empowered is a question of already existing power relations and gender norms at play. We found further that the in-laws played a central role on decisions on daughter-in-laws, whether they were, for example, able to participate in meetings to decide on, for example, the location of new infrastructures. Additionally, female-headed households, if their husbands had migrated, were very much loaded with work, so it was difficult for them to attend the meetings and to engage more in decision-making, not only in the project, but also more generally. And of course, class, caste, age, and remittances received, like income, was also quite decisive. So overall, what we found is that bargaining power within the household and the community is extremely important, and that the grouping of women is not enough. So this kind of developmental framing, giving taps to women farmers, is in opposition to social justice concerns, which feminist political ecology is mostly concerned about. When we look at intersectionality, is that the differences between women, such as age, marital status, caste, remittance flow, and land ownership, led to some women benefiting more than others. And yeah, the relational aspects were hardly looked at in the project. particularly inter-household relations, but also within households. And yeah, we thought a more nuanced and context-specific understanding of women's empowerment beyond enhanced access to resources and opportunities to develop agency, for example, through trainings, is important to include further social networks, critical consciousness, and local values. And yeah, from a transformative practice perspective, we thought this requires transformative engagements beyond indices or surveys, prescribed interventions, and conventional methods in order to open up space for horizontal discussions on local meanings, desired collaborations, and interventions, both with the farmers and also with the project staff. I introduce now the second case study, which was taken place in the eastern Terai of Nepal, North India, in northern Bihar, and in West Bengal. You see here the sites, and the objective of this was improving this study was improving dry season irrigation for marginal tenant and women farmers in the eastern Gangetic Plains. This was funded by the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. It was a truly transdisciplinary project. And it was targeting at unequal gender class caste relations in access to and control over water and land resources. It was looking at low access to irrigation water and mechanization and land fragmentation. And it was a range of research and partners and NGOs working together in this, as you see on the bottom. And this project was quite radical, you can say, a bottom-up approach, trying to be as transdisciplinary as possible. And the idea is basically linking also to some of collective farming approaches by Bina Agarwal, which means the collective leasing of land for groups of women, marginal and tenant farmers to pool labor and capital and share profits, and to have a joint ownership and management of irrigation equipment. And the outcomes were expected to increase the knowledge and labor and land pooling, to diffuse learnings, motivation, and curiosity, and lead to improved bargaining power with landlords, traders, state agencies, and intermediaries. So here are some impressions from the project work going on over almost 6 years. We have meetings both with farmer groups and the project team. A lot of technologies, drip irrigation, solar irrigation were implemented. Trainings were delivered. Like you see here, some researchers implementing technologies. And of course, there were successes in terms of harvesting some local vegetables. And these were basically building on this, around these two ideas of collective farming and irrigation technologies. And I would like to take a reflection on these two approaches with a concept called boundary objects from science and technology studies. Some of you might have heard from. So the definition of a boundary object is an entity that leaves enough interpretive flexibility for actors with diverging interests and drawing on distinct discourses to align around it and collaborate. So basically, when we take irrigation technologies as a boundary object, we find different framings in project documents and in external communication. For example, on the project, in the IMI annual review, we saw that irrigation technologies were seen with a productivity framing as a development tool to increase the use of irrigation and boost cropping intensity, while in a Migration Matters Network website of IMI, it was framed from a social justice perspective. Marginal and women farmers can increase their political power and gain economies in scale of production. And when we take collective farming as boundary object, we find an institutional framing on the project website as an alternative approach to land tenure. And in a report by the CGIAR program, Water, Land and Ecosystem, there's an social justice framing, directly address the structural challenges posed by small, fragmented, and rented holdings. So how do these different framings of one thing come about? We had a lot of encounters by different organizations with diverging interests. And an encounter is a relational and co-produced event embedded in the dimension of politics and power, social actors and organizations which possess different kinds of authority, resources, and interests. And when we now looked more deeply into the project, we saw we had a research lead, which was an international research for development organization with a mix of European and South Asian staff with different dominant framings already within the same organization. We had a productivity and technology framing by some scientists and the social justice and emotional effective framing by others. Then we had South Asian grassroots NGOs and development practitioners who were responsible for the social mobilization of the collective farming groups. They used an emotional and social equity framing. Then we had an INGO, which was mostly South Asian staff focusing on the piloting of irrigation technologies. So there was a productivity and technology framing. We had an administrative lead, which was the Australian engineering researchers with a productivity and technology framing, as well as a social equity framing. And we had an external expert who had a institutional social equity, or a social equity framing, and to some extent a productivity framing. And within all this, I was one of the gender researchers in the project as a gender postdoc. And yeah, I conducted focus group discussions, semi-structured interviews, observations, and different participatory methods in the different sites. And overall, the framing of the interventions was participatory action research in order to establish 16 farmer collectives in partnership with the local NGOs, governments, and research partners. So the idea was to accompany the group formation and institutionalization process, observing and planning irrigation trainings, crop management, planning meetings, and technology adoption. My particular role was to develop and conduct participatory gender trainings and organize farmers' exchange meetings and platforms for collaborative learning. So here are just some pictures taken from the WhatsApp group, which documented from 50 project staff interventions in the field, which were considered as success cases. And I want to reflect a bit on these contradictory framings in the project. So for example, when we take the irrigation technology or engineering framing, this was considered as a real barrier, like technical and economic problems were seen as real barriers, whereas cultural problems were seen as perceived barriers. One approach was a utility and technology adoption studies and decision support systems, which actually use a neutral user. So it was quite apolitical, measuring water flows, for example, or crop productivity regularly. And then in opposition was this relational dynamic understanding of technology adoption. And in an article we wrote afterwards, we were reflecting a bit about the ambivalence of collective farming. For example, that social relations across space were relevant, that gender norms varied across different villages, even though they were sometimes just 27 kilometers apart from each other. We noticed that intra-household and intra-community relations can both inhibit and support women's roles in these collective farming groups. And in terms of intersectionality, we found that group homogeneity and heterogeneity is highly context specific and cannot be generalized from one village to a next. And that there's a danger, again, that subordinate positions are reproduced due to the internalization of particular gendered labor roles. And finally, also, we saw that emotional attachment helped communities to overcome crop failures through mutual encouragement and informal discussions and sharing of resources and labor were more working in contexts where there was already strong ties within the local communities long before the project arrived. So what actually happened was that there were some dominant and some subordinate framings questioning which knowledge counts. So when I was arguing from my perspectives, from farmers' lived experiences, and were taking data from my interviews or other qualitative methods, it was, for example, discredited by a technical NGO. They said, you should not believe what farmers tell you. And there was one case where there was a very unequal group of landless women and farmers and land owning men, which were supposed to work together as a collective group. And I had argued this basically over years, that this group seems to or I was saying that this will have no positive outcomes if the power relations within the group members is so unequal. But actually it took me an economic measure to convince the partners of these unequitable power relationships. And I could do this only after the harvest, after the group was established, and then it was in a way too late. And it was already quite unequal. The benefits the crops were unequally distributed. And basically my argument from a social justice argument justice perspective was, okay, referring to land ownership and gender and what would be the issues around this. And then this was very difficult to bring across. But when I actually started to develop an economic argument after the harvest and calculated land and input costs and looked at the distribution at the end, I could show that one family of land-owning brothers was receiving 12 mon, which is the local unit, while the landless women just had 3 mon each. So there was a highly unequal distribution of benefits. And this was actually when I received recognition of that the group was very unequal. But interestingly, when I also asked the women about this, they said, never before we have received so much rice at once. So they are landless laborers who live off daily wages. So for them, it was not so much of an unequal experience as they had never received a bag of rice at once. So, I mean, that is also important to consider. So in a way, there was this problem that social justice analysis was not seen as legitimate. And for example, that the dominant women's empowerment framing had to be apolitical, not recognizing power relationships, but documenting single cases as community success. So in conclusion, on this second case study, we thought that group members benefit differently despite this egalitarian approach based on class and gender. The concept of individual group membership is renegotiated and aligned to existing norms and practices of farming as a household unit. But however, in enabling environments, the collective farming approach turned groups towards more equal shares due to their collectivization of labor, land, and benefits. So yeah, there's this idea by cultivating success by Ngos, for example, and boundary project objects are quite crucial in promoting expert design technologies and producing apolitical success stories of business case models. But when we take a social justice framing, the most crucial issues such as local power relations, labor and benefit management remained unresolved and dependent on or were mediated through local NGOs. So basically the learning also in this case study was there's need for space to reflect on our positionalities and framings and negotiate solutions, including gender research insights. So now to the last part, and sorry for taking a few more minutes. How can we address gender norms, roles, and relations in communities? So the idea was to promote more discussion, particularly with the farmers. And now this idea of transformative practice comes in. The idea is to negotiate gender relations and create an open space for critical discussions, storytelling, songs, reflection on gender norms, roles and relations with, in that case, collective farming groups. So this initiative or this participatory gender training we developed was basically implemented in the 2 projects I was presenting, and it was taken up by quite a few of other projects so far. So the idea behind this was grounded in critical pedagogy and teaching methodology research, which aims at promoting a critical consciousness. I won't go too much deeper into these theories, but the idea was to have a culturally grounded, gender transformative engagement approach and building on participatory principles around farmers' capabilities, value systems, beliefs, and existing agricultural practices. And of course, it should be cost effective to upscale within government organizations and NGOs. And the outcome was this manual with different activities, which I shortly introduce. The first activity was boy or girl. After that followed a discussion on the idea of gender versus sex. Then there was an activity called gender position bar, followed by a discussion on visioning successful male and female farmers. And then we had a bargaining role play at the end, followed by a discussion moving on beyond the workshop. And the principles were to promote enthusiasm, empathy, and bargaining. And the participants were encouraged to reflect their own gender perceptions and roles in their households and communities, to critically reflect gendered agricultural and domestic labor division, and to develop argumentation skills to resolve conflicts and evoke empathy by switching roles. So it was about bargaining and negotiations. And each activity is described in detail, step by step, with all the material, pictorial, visual materials provided. And yeah, we developed and piloted, implemented, and evaluated this across different sites of the 2 projects. Overall in 12 villages, and we conducted 24 trainings with about 65 field staff, which again implemented it with local farmers participating in the project. So the first activity I already mentioned aims at reflecting gender constructions in the community. The second one, so basically what we asked was if you had a medical condition, you could get only 1 child, would you rather go get a boy or a girl? And then they had to sit and split up in groups and discuss the reasons for that and present to each other in the group. And it was quite interesting that the groups were usually equally split, and there was quite a bit of discussion going on. There was not much to facilitate. People loved to discuss this question. The second one was a discussion on labor division. So we had different pictures of tasks such as weeding, irrigating, and livestock keeping, for example, and which were actually pictures taken from the communities. And then they had to arrange them in groups, whether they think it's rather male work or female labor, or if it's equally shared or mostly male or mostly female labor. So these were the 5 categories. And we had then asked to let the farmers discuss this, give reasons for it. For example, for plowing, it was meant to be more a male job because it's too technical to respect women. And irrigation is too heavy, too dangerous. The sari of the women will be caught up in the irrigation pump. And childcare would be more associated with female or both, because women are more loving or more kind-hearted. And as you can imagine, when these statements were put, other farmers would react to it, and there was a lively discussion on it. And there was not much to engage or intervene or facilitate, because there was some input which provided a good start to reflect. And the last, after these two activities, which were opening up a bit, trust or engagement among the group members, bargaining as the other gender role play was introduced. And the feedback was, for example, it's the first time playing a woman. I didn't know how to speak as a woman, as a daughter-in-law. It's difficult to attend meetings and walk in a sari as well, was what a male participant said. And then someone said, it felt weird to play a landlord and harass people older than me. It was good to have that power, but at the same time, he was an elderly person and I played a younger person's role. So there were a lot of, different perceptions around this. Yeah, that are just some more pictorial impressions from the trainings. And as a conclusion, I suppose is to say that we need more dialogue and reflections on the different framings, how projects are and interventions are framed in the development spheres, in the gender context, and particularly in the water sector. And here's just an overview of a few resources available if you're interested to read or learn more about this, like the papers I mentioned, the book, and also the gender training. And I leave you with this, and I'm happy to hear questions from your side.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. That was a really great presentation. It was so packed. I could see that there was lots of different, oh, sorry, I forgot my video. There's lots of different papers coming in. I would definitely need to look at it again. I also would like to mention that I have done myself one of your methods, boy or girl. It was wonderful, not for the sake of the research, but in the workshop. It has really opened up the gender relations. So I encourage everyone to try and see her methods and to read more about them. I would like to remind you that you can write your questions to Rob, and he's going to moderate them and to group them. Stephanie, just to open up some of the questions while people are trying to arrange their thoughts, I have a couple of questions. My first question is to understand what was your positionality in relation to other NGOs present? Were you trying to, did you come there at the same time? How did you try to improve the work? And do you think they took it on board for the future studies? And my second question was also methodological and towards this positionality that you have started presenting so wonderfully. To understand how is the selection of people happening to begin with? You started a lot speaking about the intersectionality, that there's really different types of women. How did you bring them together, different types of women, or you were making different groups? And do you think that some of these works could also break different types of inequalities, like between Dalits and other ethnic groups? Don't know who was the present between young and old and different groups, or you think that would require much more work beyond this research?
Yeah, thanks very much, Marina. On the work with NGOs, it was mostly, of course, we could not think beyond the existing hierarchies, because I was often considered as part of this international organization who comes with a new project and brings in money to conduct particular activities. But I think it was very, my experience in the two cases was quite different. So in the first one, it was a quite, the BRACE one, it was quite a fragmented approach. There was very little collaboration between the different organizations, and everyone did independently their work. So in that case, it was more about following the procedure, which was decided beforehand, before the project was implemented. And it was quite a challenge, but it worked at the end to push through an additional intervention, this gender participatory training, to get some money for it and so on. But yeah, it was quite fragmented, and the core of the project was basically meeting in Kathmandu, not in the field, for example. And in the other project, it was, in my perspective, extremely fruitful, and at least for me, the great learning experience, because the NGOs could follow their existing practices. They were the ones who actually knew the sites and the farmers quite well, who suggested how to form the groups, who were quite sensitive towards this equality approach, and selecting farmers of different castes, as they were very much based on the ground. So that was a quite different experience, and going there, working with them, I mean, I was completely dependent on their translation, on collaboration with them and so on. It was for me quite impressive to get their ideas, and they had, in a way, in my perspective, quite a lot of control to decide how to do what in the project, how to implement, which groups to target and so on, because they had so much local knowledge. And because of that, they were, in a way, really valuable partners who were very much open to outside approaches, and at the same time could translate it into the field effectively. So I think that was far more transdisciplinary in that sense than the first project, which was more centered around Kathmandu and the UK. And at the end, people were just delivering something in the field. So I found there very strong hierarchies at different levels also. And in the second one, it was really a lot about being in the field, of making everyone involved in the project meet at the project sites, visit the project sites and so on, and have discussions at the project sites most of the time. So I think location made a huge difference in that sense. And of course, to work with real grassroots organizations. And in terms of the groups, how were they formed? In the second project, I already mentioned that the local NGOs decided on them. So basically in northern Bihar, this collective farming approach was actually building on earlier collective fishing interventions. So they already had some good knowledge of the community, and there were a lot of meetings consecutive held to decide who would be fitting and willing, because it was in a way linked to land ownership, or even not land ownership, but some land needed to be arranged. And this took place over a lot of years, and there were a lot of shifts in the groups and conflicts in the groups, and it was quite messy, as reality is. But in this sense, why it was successful in many parts, in many groups at the end, was because a lot of time was spent on the ground, a lot of close collaboration and repetitive meetings was happening. So there was almost, I can't say numbers, but at least monthly engagements. And I think that proved very successful, while in the other project, names were given of the most powerful farmers in the village. The groups met when an external person would come, and they would dissolve afterwards after receiving the benefits. And I think that was a bit different in the other project, where there was continued engagement on the ground and closer communication between the partners involved. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. If it's okay, we'll just move on. I think I have asked a very broad question. Sorry for that. The first question, the person didn't want to say it, themselves. During the discussions, did transgender or non-binary persons come up at all? And before you answer, I'll just ask Catherine, after this answer, please, you are next, if you can say your question yourself. Thank you.
Yes, very interesting question. We found actually just one transgender person in the first project. And it was a young person, 13 years old, so it was not part of any of the decision-making process. But yeah, there are, there are people like that, but they were not basically, in a way, integrated in that project. So I guess your question refers a bit to working with this binary of women and men, for example, in the participatory gender training of what associations do you have with a woman, which one with a man, and so on. So I think it's a really interesting question, and we need to think about how to develop this further in this quite binary approach about discussing gender norms. Yeah, as a short answer.
Hi, Stephanie. Thanks so much for your presentation. So you talked a little bit about the engineering and social relations approaches and how they're contradictory, which I know these kind of epistemological hierarchies can be quite frustrating for social scientists who tend to be at the bottom end of the pecking order. I was wondering if you can comment from your experience on whether that you see ways for engineering and social relations approaches to shift towards becoming complementary.
Yeah, thanks for this question. I'm just in conversation, or have been in very close conversation with one of the engineers, and we still plan to publish together. And it's a bit of a tricky thing, but I presented my presentation to him, and some more critical stances where he said, oh, I don't agree on this. And I was very open to also see that my perspective is also quite, in a way, critical. So, I mean, it really went more over different social or emotional relations that, you know, we went together in the evenings, sat together apart from work, engaged in discussion, reflected on how the project is going, and we found commonalities, of course, there as well about the how the project was going, on long rides to the field, 5 hours at part cramped in a small car. You know, like these relations can be overcome, but in or different frames can be worked towards, reflected more in informal spaces. I guess that would be my quick answer on this learning, because yeah, I mean, as much engagement as possible, as much as reflection as possible, but in a very like welcoming atmosphere, and that usually outside of you know, the project side table or something, because there the discussions were very much difficult to lead. But of course, it's important first of all to bring women and gender scientists on the table. That was also, of course, an issue by itself. So presence of different perspectives is the first step, and then, yeah, continued engagement in informal spaces. Thank you.
If it's okay, I'll just read 2 questions, and we are quite running short on time, so you can choose to answer both very quickly. So first one from Sylvia Cup from USA. Was there any discussion on reduction in the practice of chapati in the areas where you worked? And the second question by Ananya Chakraborty. What is your take on gender perceptions of technical stakeholders? How does the positionality and unequal power relations of the engineers and scientists impact community participation?
Yeah, thanks for asking for chapati. It's forbidden by law now in Nepal. That's a practice that women are kept secluded during their menstruation, and there have been still practices going on. There's still, I mean, at least newspaper articles reporting that young girls die because of this practice, as they are kept separately in animal stalls and so on. So it's a very serious issue, and it's an example of how, yeah, policy decides we abolish it, but in practice, it's difficult to, or takes a long time to change cultural practices. The projects were both very much focused on irrigation, and so they were not at all engaging with the chapati question at all. Yeah, I think overall I can say that I would critique this very sectorial approach, because as you saw in some of the findings, people were mentioning land issues, and land is very closely connected. To look only at water issues without looking at land is not moving forward, and also seeing water more as a holistic thing linked to sanitation and menstruation and other issues as well would be also an important way forward, have intersectorial understanding. And regarding the gender perception of technical stakeholders, difficult topic. So I think what could most happen there or be most effective is really to bring in, make space, give funding to gender researchers, to women staff, to have more women staff in decisive positions at the project level to make a difference, because I think through that issues of, for example, female farmers can be raised. I mean, there's always this, yes, we know the culture, we know how it is, women are like this and that, and these are their issues, but there is not this radical passion to change it in many cases. There are exemptions, but yeah. Thanks for both or all questions so far.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. There's so many things I would personally also like to ask. I'm sure that you can write questions or type when we will upload it on Reach, on Water, on YouTube. And the moment, I would just like to remind you about the second seminar on June 4th. Please come. We're very happy to see you. And thank you, Stephanie, so much. It was just so interesting and so condensed. I wish we had 2 hours. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your questions and joining. And you can always drop me an email. I'm very happy to keep in touch with anyone via email.